The drive that we have to do this comes from our very specific knowledge of the transactional dynamics of social institutions. A lot of what we do is based on behavioral economics. In combination with that, there are game theory models that explain important things about how human beings operate, either individually or as part of groups when they transact. The enhanced knowledge that the scientific community has of cognitive psychology and the way our brain is structured and the way it operates. Those things have led to a revolution of sorts in understanding how things operate in reality compared with how they're expected to operate. A good example of this is that all the models of economics that deal with consumer behavior or the behavior of entities when they're trying to maximize or optimize their utility in a process work on the presumption that people are rational beings and they pursue utility in a rational way, that they have agency over their decisions. In reality, though people are capable of rationality, they're not actually fully rational creatures. The dual model of the functioning of the brain that is now accepted in the scientific community as the best mechanism to explain how the mind works clarifies that people normally operate on autopilot and they're driven by instinct. They are capable of thinking rationally, but it's a very energy intensive process. It is also localized to very specific parts of the brain that have less control in certain situations. So there's two parts of your brain effectively that process logic. The part of the brain that processes abstract logic is different from the part of the brain that deals with social interaction or especially social justice related issues. What all of this means is that people think of themselves as a number of things and they reimagine their life in terms of the recollection of things. They construct memories compatible with that narrative, but the way they make decisions is based on instinct. They operate on impulses. It makes them very manipulable. And where you have social institutions that are ultimately an agglomeration of individuals that behave that way, you can set out policies or objectives for the institution and expect it to behave a certain way. Its ability to actually function in that way is predetermined. For example, there was a study done in Tel Aviv. It's one of the most extensive cognitive psychology studies done in cooperation with the judiciary. Researchers from some of the most prestigious universities in the world spent several months monitoring the work of judges at one of the highest appellate courts of criminal law in Tel Aviv. Their job is to see whether the people that have been convicted of some of the most serious crimes have been convicted properly, whether they were given due process and so on and so forth. The judges were hearing appeals from denials of parole and other appeals in relation to the criminal law. Their task is not so much to determine whether or not the person is guilty, but to determine whether or not they've been given due process, whether their right to procedural fairness has been contravened, and the overall effect of that contravention. What the researchers found is that depending on what time in the day the appeal was heard, the result was predictably a certain way. The best outcome was if the appeals were heard early in the morning or right after lunch. if they were heard just before lunch or at the end of the day, then there was a significant difference in the probability of success in double-digit percentages. It was in excess of 20%, a massive difference. If the judges heard the case first thing in the morning, the person whose case was being heard, a much higher chance of getting the denial of their parole application reversed. The way the scientists explain this is in terms of the dual model of the brain. The two models of the brain are classified as system 1 and system 2. System 1 is instinctive. It works on impulse. It doesn't meticulously process information. It works on cues. It's not very good at considering everything or even observing everything. It's supposed to work very quickly and react effectively. It's the part that is susceptible to stereotypes and biases and everything else. System 2 is the rational part. It's deliberative. It considers things. It's very energy consuming. People cannot operate in System 2 forever. It's very difficult for them to operate in System 2 for any considerable time. Most people will not even operate in System 2 for 1 hour at a time. Whether or not people can operate in System 2 for a considerable time depends on a number of things. Genetics is very important. Conditioning also plays a role. The judicial system works on the presumption that people are rational creatures and they apply the law to the facts in a mechanical way. Like mathematicians solve equations for specific variables, but that's not really how people actually work. What the study demonstrates is that when you have a lot of energy available, people who are capable of functioning in System 2 will be more likely to function in the System 2 mode. But the moment their brain anticipates that there's a limited amount of energy, when their glucose levels drop, the brain will start cutting off. You can think of it in terms of a physical analogy as two different machines or equipment, and the brain will stop giving power to the equipment that is very energy consuming, but also the brain thinks that it is unnecessary. Because System 1 is how you survive. It's what you do when you get attacked, or if you have to save your life or someone else's. System 2 is how you build strategic weapons or whatever. But in the case of emergency, System 1 is how you generally operate. It's not that the two systems cannot operate at the same time, but it's that when they do, System 1 will basically start making decisions before System 2 can figure out what needs to be done. So it really doesn't matter what System 2 wants. The point is that when the judges had a lot of energy or when their glucose levels were not low, they concentrated on the details of the process to figure out whether something had gone wrong. Whereas when they had low glucose levels, they could not focus on every detail. They started making presumptions. They started skipping over things. This is a fact of the human condition. Technically, even in countries where the rule of law is sound, the executive and the judiciary don't have any practical collusion or interaction in terms of how the cases should be decided. The fact is that the executive controls the way in which the cases are brought forward before the judiciary, and they can do a number of things to manipulate the outcome, even if the system is working perfectly the way it's supposed to work. You know, if you have completely impartial judges who are trying to do their best, you can have the best judge in the world who is basically a monk all they do is just dedicate their whole life to studying the law or other aspects of things that affect judicial decision making. But even with that judge, depending on how you put the case forward to them, you can affect the outcome. If that judge is sleep deprived when you bring the case to them, the way they deal with the case will be different. That's one thing. The second thing is that the way things are presented or the context in which they're presented fundamentally changes the way they're perceived. For instance, if I told you that you have to sacrifice one arm to save 10 lives, your keenness to do it will be different if you thought that no one would die if you sacrifice your arm versus if you heard that if you didn't sacrifice your arm, 10 million people would die. But if you sacrificed your arm, 10 million minus 10 people would die. Value of life is fundamentally affected by the context of the number of lives being lost. This is just the very basic stuff that I can talk about as a quick example that you'll instantly understand. But then there's a lot of very complicated things that are difficult to understand sometimes, or you need a lot of patience to see how they work in combination. Because of all of those things, there are a number of myths about the judicial system which are unmaintainable. You can see their effect in the way the statistics represent the functioning of the system. Like you can see a number of other systemic wrongs in the statistics of the outcome of the judicial process. What we're trying to do is identify the specific way in which those things go wrong and the specific way in which the inherent limitations of human beings and the way the system is conceived predictably affect the outcome, and they can be manipulated. So it's not what people think of it, even the people that recognize bias and all the other things, what they think of it is that it's like inaccuracy. They compare it to inefficiency in the performance of a machine. Sometimes it will make mistakes. The margin of error is this much, and you can never know. What that presumes is that the mistakes will equally affect both sides. The government that's trying to go after people and the people that are trying to defend themselves. But it's not actually like that. The limitations can be manipulated so that not only are the ill effects of the limitations of the system borne by just one party, but you can actually accentuate the amount of mistakes that people will make based on the way you play the game. For instance, when someone is charged, it's an accusation that's made against them by the government. It doesn't mean anything on its own, other than the fact that someone is accusing them of something. You're innocent until proven guilty. That's the whole point of the judiciary. But the way in which you're charged can be strategically manipulated by government bodies to signal some things about a person. So if they want to bring a case forward about someone and they don't have a strong case, they can add additional charges, which they will never be able to prove, but which will effectively signal something to the judge about what would have happened in terms of the events. Again, that was just a very easily demonstrable example, but there's a number of things about this. One of the challenges that the process of progress faces is that the people that study these things, that discover the issues, they remain confined to the academia, the universities and higher education institutions and various researchers. They know a lot about the problems of judicial decision making. There's been a number of books and research papers that have been published recently, but none of that actually gets passed on to the system itself. There are government bodies that are responsible for updating and revising systems so they can benefit from all the new discoveries that we have about the human condition. But even if they're working properly, they can only make recommendations. Ultimately, the way things work, the way justice is affected in each case is basically flawed. What we're trying to do is demonstrate how these systemic issues work. We engage in a lot of public interest litigation. We have a very confrontational position in many of those cases. And then we develop reports to publish the investigations that we conduct and so on. We're a new organization in terms of when we started publishing, but we've been doing this for several years. We have developed a lot of content, which we are in the process of publishing imminently. We're involved in some very important cases at the moment, and we need to create publicity about them and make sure that everybody understands what we're doing. Much of our current challenges stem from the fact that we're working in a very specific area where there's no conventional or mainstream process or industry. What we're effectively trying to do is be a private ombudsman of sorts. So what we're trying to do is help people enforce the law against government bodies. It's technically the domain of government institutions. There's specific government departments that are responsible for that sort of work, but we're trying to use the law innovatively to circumvent the public institutions through which laws are enforced and directly go about holding government bodies that are not doing what they should be doing to account. We're focusing firstly on matters where the administration of justice is involved. We have the law on our side, but it only works if we can effectively convince the people who need to make the decision about whether or not we do within the right time and in the most effective way. I think the important thing about us is that, one, we're a very passionate and dedicated organization. The people here take huge personal risks to do what they do because it's a very urgently necessary thing. It's good for team spirit as well. There's a camaraderie that goes into it, which is necessary because it helps manage their emotions and it motivates them.